Welcome to Bumpy Johnson Uncensored, where we dive deep into the real history, the real streets, and the real names behind America's most shocking crime stories. Before we jump into today's intense case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from: Harlem, the Bronx, Chicago, L.A., anywhere in the world. And make sure you hit that subscribe button, because the amount of research that goes into pulling the true records, verified details, and hidden facts takes a lot of time, and your support helps keep these stories alive and uncensored. It all began with something that seemed small at first: a quiet absence. Bumpy Johnson's nephew was known in Harlem as a sharp, respectful, smart young man who never vanished without letting someone know where he was going. Family members noticed he hadn't come home one evening, but at first they assumed he got caught up with friends, maybe hanging around the block or visiting someone across town. But by the next morning, tension started to rise. His bed hadn't been touched. His clothes were still laid out the way he left them. His usual breakfast plate, always half eaten before he rushed out the door, was still sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. And the strange part was that his friends didn't know anything either. Every person the family spoke to said the same thing: "We haven't seen him since yesterday." As hours turned into the first full day, the mood in the Johnson household shifted from concern to fear. This wasn't like him. He wasn't the type to run away. He wasn't mixed up in anything heavy. And he certainly wasn't the kind of kid who crossed the wrong people. Bumpy himself, despite all his reputation and power, felt something heavy in his gut, something he rarely admitted. Harlem was filled with noise. On that day, it felt like the streets were whispering. Rumors started buzzing around corners, storefronts, back alleys. Some people said they saw the boy talking to someone unfamiliar. Others claimed a strange car was circling the block, but no story lined up perfectly, and nobody wanted to talk too loud. Family members went to the police, but instead of urgency, got hesitation. Officers brushed it off as, maybe he wandered off, or he'll turn up. But the family knew that wasn't true. The boy had patterns, routines, and suddenly those routines were broken in a way that didn't make sense. With each hour that passed, fear wrapped around the family tighter. The silence from his phone, the lack of any footprints or hints of where he went, and the growing uncertainty in the community all pointed to one thing: this wasn't an accident. Something had happened, something intentional, something dark. By nightfall, Harlem had already started watching Bumpy closely. One missing young man might not shake a city, but when he was related to one of the most influential figures in Harlem, the stakes changed instantly. Bumpy's expression hardened, his quiet rage simmering beneath the surface. He didn't need police permission, and he wasn't waiting for anyone to give him answers. He started calling in favors, asking questions, pulling strings. People who were too scared to talk earlier suddenly found their memories returning when they realized who was asking. And yet, even with Bumpy's pressure, details remained blurry, uncertain, filled with contradictions. The disappearance wasn't random, it was deliberate. And it was only the beginning of the chaos that would explode across Harlem over the next 7 days. By the second day, Harlem was no longer calm. What started as a quiet disappearance had already begun spreading through barber shops, corner stores, diners, pool halls, and every stoop where people gathered to talk. Folks didn't need a news bulletin. Harlem had its own fast, moving network of whispers. Everyone knew something wasn't right, and they knew something even more troubling. Bumpy Johnson was searching. When Bumpy searched, the whole neighborhood felt it. His presence alone shifted the energy on the block. People who usually laughed loudly were suddenly speaking in low tones. Even the kids, who usually ran through the streets without a care, were being pulled inside by parents who sensed the tension in the air. The streets felt heavier, like Harlem itself was holding its breath. People were scared, not just scared of what happened to the boy, but scared of what Bumpy might do once he found out. Harlem knew Bumpy wasn't the type of man who let family matters go unanswered. He wasn't reckless, but he wasn't passive either. He played chess, not checkers. Behind the scenes, he had already started positioning people, asking the right questions, reaching into corners most lawmen didn't even know existed. Every move he made was quiet, calculated, obvious enough that Harlem recognized the shift. Shop owners noticed unfamiliar men standing on corners. Neighbors peeked through curtains more than usual. Drivers cruising down Lenox Avenue slowed down, sensing the unease. Meanwhile, the rumors grew louder. Some people whispered that the disappearance might be connected to racial hostility brewing in certain pockets of the city. Others speculated it had something to do with outsiders trying to push into Harlem's territory. Some even believed it was meant as a message, not to the boy, but to Bumpy himself. But no rumor came with proof, just speculation fueled by fear. And that fear spread faster than truth ever could. People who normally avoided getting involved suddenly found themselves double, locking doors, avoiding nighttime errands, and keeping their eyes open. The police presence didn't help. Officers arrived, not to search, to monitor. And that only made things worse. Their patrol cars rolled slowly through the neighborhood, not out of concern, out of caution, almost like they were afraid of what might pop off. The disconnect between police and the community became painfully obvious. Harlem needed answers. Bumpy demanded answers. The police seemed more interested in staying out of it, giving excuses, and pretending this was a simple missing person situation that would resolve itself. The community felt abandoned. By now, tension had built to a point where even strangers exchanged cautious glances. Harlem did not like uncertainty, and the absence of truth was causing more chaos than the actual act. Everyone felt like something big was coming. Something was going to break, and when it did, Harlem knew the streets wouldn't stay quiet. Because when a young man went missing in a place already wounded by discrimination, mistrust, and simmering conflict, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a spark, and everyone could feel the heat rising. By the third day, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a worried uncle. He had transformed into a relentless force tearing through Harlem's shadows in search of truth. Bumpy wasn't a man who relied on luck. He relied on information, loyalty, and fear, and Harlem knew exactly what that meant. When he walked into a room, conversations stopped. When he looked someone in the eye, they told the truth or wished they had. And now he was personally knocking on doors, stepping into basements, questioning people who normally thought they were untouchable. Even the hardest men in Harlem felt their pulse spike when Bumpy asked a simple question: "Where's my nephew?" But the deeper he dug, the stranger everything became. Some people claimed they saw the boy talking to someone wearing a dark coat near the bus stop. Others said a car without of state plates was circling Lenox Avenue earlier that day. A few even whispered that outsiders, men nobody recognized, had been seen asking about Bumpy's family days before the disappearance. Yet every trail went cold. Leads contradicted each other. Witnesses changed their stories. People who usually bragged about what they saw suddenly claimed they saw nothing at all. The silence wasn't natural, it was forced, like someone was deliberately pushing fear into the community to keep mouths shut. Bumpy sensed it immediately. Someone was trying to control the narrative. Someone wanted confusion. Someone wanted him blind. But Bumpy wasn't a man who got confused easily. His mind worked like a detective's, analyzing every detail, connecting patterns others didn't even notice. He retraced his nephew's last known movements, from school to the corner store to the alley, where the boy was seen just hours before he vanished. He spoke to friends, checked phone lines, followed footprints in conversations, not on sidewalks, and every answer led to more questions. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Bumpy found out that the police had received a tip and ignored it. A shop owner reported suspicious activity near the neighborhood days before the disappearance, but officers brushed it off. Single detail lit a fire in Bumpy's chest. Police hesitation wasn't new. Ignoring a warning that might have saved his nephew shook him in a way few things could. Suddenly, Bumpy realized this wasn't just about a missing boy. This was about deeper forces at play, forces that didn't want him to find the truth, so he doubled down. He started meeting people at odd hours. He pulled trusted men off their usual duties and gave them one mission. Find the boy, find the car, find anything. Day turned into night, night into early dawn, and Bumpy barely slept. Coffee cups piled up. Cigarette smoke filled back rooms where he interrogated men who would normally never fold. But even they seemed terrified, not of Bumpy, but of something else. Something they refused to name. And that's when it hit him. The fear in Harlem wasn't just fear of him. It was fear of whoever took his nephew. Someone had made a calculated move. Someone had planned this. Someone with enough nerve to challenge Harlem's most respected figure. Bumpy understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whoever was behind this had no idea what kind of storm they had just unleashed. By the fourth day, Harlem wasn't just tense. It was divided by fear, anger, and whispers that felt heavier than the truth itself. People were starting to talk, not loudly, but in hushed tones behind closed doors and cracked windows. There was a growing rumor spreading across the blocks, a rumor that chilled the neighborhood more than the disappearance itself. Some residents claimed the boy had been targeted not because of anything he did, but because of who he was and what he represented. Word on the street hinted that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong, nor a random act of violence. It was deliberate. It was planned. It was meant to send a message. Some older residents, who had lived through harsh racial tensions in the past, said they had seen unfamiliar faces lingering in Harlem days before the disappearance, men who didn't belong, men who avoided eye contact, men who seemed to be watching rather than wandering. These sightings sparked whispers that the boy may have been targeted due to the rising racial hostility present in certain areas around the city. People who had experienced or witnessed racial intimidation in the past recognized the feeling immediately. They talked about it the way people talk about storms. You sense the pressure before the sky breaks. Harlem had always been a place of resilience, but it had also been a battleground for racial conflict for decades. Tensions between black neighborhoods and discriminatory forces from outside the community were nothing new. This rumor added a new level of fear, because it wasn't just about the past, it was happening now. People started revisiting events from years earlier, recounting stories of outsiders entering neighborhoods they didn't belong in, provoking violence, then disappearing before anyone could confront them. That memory resurfaced now with alarming clarity. What made everything more unsettling was that these rumors didn't come from one person or one block. They were coming from multiple directions. Residents who didn't even know each other were describing similar experiences. Late, night shadows, slow, moving cars, faces hidden beneath hats, people pretending to shop but watching instead of buying. And the way these stories aligned made Harlem wonder if this was all part of something coordinated. Bumpy heard these rumors too. At first, he brushed them off. Rumors can mislead, they can distract, they can cloud judgment. But the more he listened, the more he recognized a pattern. People weren't just inventing stories, they were sharing fragments of something they didn't fully understand. And the fear in their voices wasn't exaggerated, it was real. It carried the weight of lived experience. Harlem had seen racial intimidation before, and the signs now felt eerily familiar. This led Bumpy to a dangerous conclusion. Whoever took his nephew didn't just want to hurt the boy. They wanted to provoke the entire neighborhood. They wanted to test Harlem's response. And they wanted to see how far Bumpy would go when confronted with an attack that wasn't just personal, but symbolic. The worst part was that no one knew what was true and what was rumor. But Harlem understood one thing very clearly. When racial tension mixes with fear, the outcome is never simple and never safe. And with every new whisper, every new sighting, and every new rumor, the situation grew more volatile. The community wasn't just waiting for answers anymore. They were bracing for something larger, something darker, something nobody wanted to say out loud. By the fifth day, something unsettling began happening across Harlem. Witnesses, who had been willing to talk earlier, suddenly stopped speaking altogether. It was like the entire neighborhood had been wrapped in an invisible blanket of fear. People who had whispered bits of information on day one were now avoiding eye contact. Residents who previously claimed they saw suspicious movement near the alley were shutting their doors. Even the shop owners who always had something to say about street activity were suddenly out of the loop, or pretending they didn't remember anything. It wasn't normal silence. It was the kind that felt forced, pressured, controlled. This shift was loud enough for Bumpy to notice immediately. He saw the way people's eyes darted around before answering simple questions. He saw how quickly conversations ended the moment he walked into a room. He recognized the signs. Harlem wasn't just scared of him. It was scared of someone else. But who? Why? What kind of threat could silence an entire community that usually had no fear discussing what happened on its own streets? Some residents refused to even open their doors when Bumpy's men knocked. Others spoke through cracks in the doorframe, whispering only one word: danger. Some claimed they saw unfamiliar men watching them from across the street the moment they tried to speak. A few hinted that they had been approached late at night by people warning them to stay quiet. But when pressed for details, their voices dropped, their lips tightened, and it was clear they wouldn't say more. It wasn't that they didn't want to talk. It was that they believed talking could cost them more than they were willing to risk. The silence was contagious. Harlem was a place where word traveled fast, and now the message being passed around was simple: don't say a word. And that silence wasn't natural. Bumpy knew that. This wasn't fear of him. Harlem respected him. This was fear of an unknown presence, a shadow lurking beyond the neighborhood, a pressure that made ordinary people shrink into themselves. Bumpy felt this shift deeply. It wasn't just frustrating, it was alarming. If someone had enough power to intimidate Harlem into silence, meant this wasn't a small time operation. It meant there was coordination, planning, and intention. The fact that witnesses were backing down so quickly told Bumpy one thing: whoever was behind this wasn't acting alone. They had a network, influence, and the ability to make people disappear or suffer consequences. At night, Bumpy walked the streets himself, watching from the shadows. He saw families pulling their children inside early. He saw men pacing corners nervously. He saw the way people paused when police cars passed by, uncertain whether the officers were there to protect them or ignore them again. He even noticed how the usual nighttime noise, music, laughter, arguments, had dulled into an eerie quiet. This wasn't paranoia. This was strategic silence, the kind enforced through intimidation. And the worst part, it meant the truth was out there. Someone had seen something crucial. Someone knew what happened, but now they were too frightened to open their mouth. And with each passing minute of that silence, Bumpy's determination hardened. Harlem might have been scared into quiet. Bumpy Johnson was the kind of man who listened even when no one spoke. He understood that silence could be louder than words, and now that the entire neighborhood had gone quiet, he realized the truth was closer than ever and far more dangerous than he expected. The sixth day, the silence from the police was no longer just suspicious, it was blatant. Harlem had seen slow responses before, especially when it came to missing black youth, but this situation felt different. Officers weren't just dragging their feet, they were avoiding involvement altogether. When Bumpy's family went to the precinct, they were met with the same cold, rehearsed lines. "We're looking into it. We don't have enough evidence to escalate the case." Or the most insulting one of all, is probably just out with friends. But by day 6, everyone knew this wasn't a runaway case. The police knew it too. That's why their hesitation looked more like fear than laziness. Some officers avoided eye contact altogether, shuffling papers or pretending to look busy when the family walked in. Others quietly hinted they were not authorized to discuss certain details. A few acted like they didn't even know a missing persons report had been filed. It was almost as if someone had instructed them to stay out of it, and the officers were complying. Even more telling was the way patrol cars navigated the neighborhood. They drove slower, more cautiously, like they were afraid of stirring something up. They didn't question anyone, didn't knock on doors, didn't search alleys. They simply circled the area like passive observers, waiting for someone else to act first. Residents noticed it too. People whispered that certain officers seemed unusually nervous, glancing over their shoulders, talking in hushed tones, boarding up their own curiosity. Word spread that one officer had received an anonymous warning telling him to back off, and instead of reporting it, he simply did. Another officer, who usually patrolled the area like clockwork, was suddenly reassigned to a different district without explanation. It felt like the entire police system was pulling away, retreating, as though they believed getting involved would ignite a fire they had no way to control. Bumpy saw this pattern immediately. He knew the difference between police incompetence and police fear. He had spent enough time dealing with law enforcement to recognize the signs. This wasn't apathy, it was avoidance. It was as if the police were aware of something the community didn't know, something that terrified them enough to step back instead of stepping in, and their behavior confirmed a dangerous suspicion. Whatever force had taken his nephew wasn't just targeting the family. It was strong enough to intimidate the authorities, too. One moment in particular exposed everything. When Bumpy confronted a detective privately, the man's hands visibly shook. He didn't have answers, but he did have a warning. This isn't just a neighborhood issue. Stay out of it. That single sentence made the situation clear. Someone had enough influence to scare the police into neutrality. If the police were this afraid, Harlem had every reason to fear the worst. But Bumpy wasn't wired like most people. Police fear didn't make him step back, it pushed him forward. If the authorities refused to act, then he would take matters into his own hands. And by day 6, the line between justice and retaliation was getting thinner by the hour. Harlem sensed it too. People could feel a storm building, one that the police were desperate to avoid, even if it meant abandoning a missing child. The message was clear. The police weren't going to save Bumpy's nephew. They weren't even going to look for him. This battle was going to fall entirely on Bumpy's shoulders. With each moment the police stayed silent, Bumpy grew more resolved, more focused, and more dangerous. By the 7th day, Harlem was no longer a neighborhood waiting for answers. It had become a neighborhood demanding them. The silence, the fear, the unanswered questions, and the obvious hesitation from authorities had finally pushed the community to a breaking point. What began as small whispers and cautious conversations now erupted into frustration that could be felt in every corner of the city. People gathered in groups outside building stoops, barbershops filled with heated debates, and church leaders held urgent meetings, trying to keep the peace while acknowledging the growing anger burning through Harlem's core. Everyone felt it, a collective outrage that came from both fear and exhaustion. The disappearance of Bumpy's nephew wasn't just another tragedy. It symbolized something bigger. The way young black lives were dismissed, ignored, or brushed aside when help was needed most. For years, Harlem had dealt with systemic neglect, but this case was the tipping point. Mothers tightened their grip on their children. Fathers walked the streets at night, searching alleys and abandoned lots. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other before were suddenly united by a shared urgency. They started organizing search groups, putting up hand-drawn posters, and calling out the police for their lack of response. Voices grew louder. Demands grew stronger. Church leaders stepped forward, urging calm, but also insisting that justice be pursued. Local shop owners donated flashlights, supplies, and even food to the volunteers who gathered each night to calm the streets. Harlem wasn't waiting for the police anymore. They were searching for answers themselves. And the more they searched, the angrier they became. Because everywhere they looked, the same signs repeated silence, fear, intimidation, and a growing sense that someone was deliberately keeping the truth buried. Bumpy watched this rise of anger with a heavy heart. On one hand, he appreciated the community's support. He had always been a protector of Harlem, and now Harlem was standing by him in return. But he also knew that rage could be unpredictable. If the situation continued to escalate, the streets could explode into chaos, something he wanted to avoid. He walked through the crowds, calming tempers, assuring people that he would handle it personally, promising that justice would come. But even with his presence, even with his reputation, the neighborhood's fury was bigger than any one man. Harlem wasn't just angry about the nephew. They were angry about the system, the fear and the feeling that they were being hunted in their own community. The most telling moment came when elderly residents, the ones who usually stayed indoors, watching from their windows, stepped outside to join the effort. These were people who had lived through the worst racial tensions of past decades, and their involvement showed just how serious things had become. Their presence alone moved younger residents, reminding them that this wasn't the first time Harlem had been pushed too far. Their shaken voices filled with memories of old wounds, fueled the younger generation's determination to find out what happened. And still, despite all the community's anger and unity, no new leads emerged. The silence remained unbroken. Witnesses still refused to talk. Authorities still kept their distance. And the boy remained missing. That's when Harlem's anger turned into pressure directed at one man. People began looking at Bumpy not just as the uncle of the missing boy, as the only person powerful enough to take action when everyone else had failed. They trusted him more than the police. They believed he could uncover the truth, and that trust came with a heavy weight. The community was no longer just grieving or fearful. They were demanding answers, and they were looking to Bumpy to deliver them. As the week dragged on after the murder of Bumpy Johnson's nephew, Harlem transformed into a neighborhood walking on eggshells. People who normally filled the sidewalks, street vendors, kids playing stickball, barbers laughing outside their shops, were acting different. Conversations got quieter. Eyes shifted before anyone spoke. Folks kept their heads down because they knew this wasn't just another killing in New York. This one had weight behind it. This one had the Johnson name attached. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was a symbol in Harlem. Some saw him as a protector, others feared him, but almost everyone respected him. And now that his own blood had been taken in such a brutal and public way, people knew there would be consequences. Harlem had its own pulse, and right now, that pulse was beating fast and nervous. Within the community, everyone had a theory. Some whispered that a white supremacist group from out of state had come into Harlem to cause trouble. Others believed it was a targeted message meant for Bumpy personally, an attempt to provoke him into a war he couldn't win. There were even those who thought certain corrupt officials might have let it happen or even helped cover it up. Every rumor created more tension. Crowds gathered on corners just to speculate, each person adding something new to the story. In times like that, Harlem became its own news network. Truth, fear, and imagination all mixed together. And once a rumor started, it traveled fast, sometimes faster than the actual facts. Business owners were especially nervous. They didn't know if retaliation would spill onto their streets, or if something bigger was coming. Some locked their doors early. Some kept a lookout behind the counter. Some quietly prayed for calm. Harlem had been through rough times before: police raids, riots, gang shootouts, racial attacks. But this incident was different because it cut deep emotionally. It wasn't about territory. It wasn't about money. It was personal. And when something becomes personal in the underworld, that's when the most unpredictable things happen. Church leaders tried to calm people down, urging them not to jump to conclusions or take matters into their own hands. Meanwhile, street hustlers and neighborhood figures posted themselves outside key blocks just to keep an eye on things. They weren't taking orders from anyone. They were simply protecting the neighborhood from outsiders who might try to stir up more trouble. Harlem, despite its chaos, always had an internal code. Outsiders didn't get to harm the people who lived there. And if someone did, the community reacted like a single organism, cautious, aware, and ready for the worst. The absence of official justice only intensified the unease. People noticed that the police weren't asking many questions. They weren't knocking on doors. They weren't gathering witnesses. It was almost like nothing happened. That silence from the authorities made Harlem feel even more abandoned. When a community believes the system won't protect them, they start looking elsewhere for justice, and everyone in Harlem knew exactly who they looked to: Bumpy. Whether They agreed with his lifestyle or not. They knew he wouldn't let something like this slide. So the entire neighborhood found itself waiting for his next move, almost like waiting for a storm to hit. Every night, the streets buzzed with talk about what Bumpy might be planning. Some thought he would go to the police commissioner directly. Others thought he would send out his own men to hunt the killers down. There were rumors that people from other boroughs were already slipping into Harlem just to watch how he would respond. That's how big his reputation was when Bumpy was preparing to make a move. People from outside neighborhoods came just to witness the fallout. By that point, Harlem wasn't just tense, it was holding its breath. The killing of his nephew wasn't just a tragedy, it had become a symbolic attack on the community itself. And Harlem was watching, waiting, and bracing for what would come next, because everyone knew one thing: when someone challenged Bumpy Johnson on a personal level, the response was never quiet, never small, and never forgotten. By the time the seventh day arrived, Harlem was locked in suspense. Everyone knew Bumpy Johnson wasn't going to rely on the police. He had waited, he had watched, and he had given the authorities more than enough time to act. And when they didn't, he made a decision that would shift the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood. If the police wouldn't bring justice for his nephew, Bumpy would create his own investigation, one that didn't involve paperwork, warrants, or polite conversations. His investigation would be fast, quiet, and direct, the type of investigation that only someone with Bumpy's reach could pull off. Harlem's streets began to change overnight, and it wasn't the police making rounds, it was Bumpy's men. He started by sending trusted lieutenants into every corner of the neighborhood. These weren't random street guys. They were people who had been with him for years, men who understood loyalty and knew how to gather information without causing panic. They visited bars, pool halls, gambling spots, and backroom clubs, places where people talked freely when the wrong ears weren't listening, and Bumpy made sure the right ears were listening now. Anyone who had seen something, anyone who had heard a whisper, anyone who had even the smallest piece of information, Bumpy wanted to hear it. And because of who he was, people talked. Not out of fear, out of respect, and sometimes out of anger. Harlem didn't want outsiders coming in and killing one of their own. It didn't take long for fragments of the truth to surface. Someone recalled an unfamiliar car cruising the block the night before the murder. Another person remembered seeing a group of men who didn't look local, dressed too clean, standing too stiff, watching the neighborhood like they didn't belong. Someone else claimed they heard racial slurs shouted from a passing vehicle earlier that week. None of these details were enough on their own, but together they created a pattern that didn't point to neighborhood rivals or internal conflicts. It pointed to outsiders with a motive rooted in hate. Bumpy pieced these clues together like a man who had solved countless street problems before, and every piece of information pushed him closer to the same conclusion: this was not random. It was planned. Someone had intentionally come into Harlem to make a statement, and because the police never moved on it, many believed there were hands behind the scenes protecting the attackers. That thought infuriated Bumpy more than the killing itself. It meant the system not only failed his nephew, it silently cooperated with his killers. His investigation grew more intense. Bumpy reached out to contacts outside Harlem, people he knew in Queens, in Brooklyn, even out of state. He put the word out that he was looking for anyone tied to extremist groups, anyone who had recently traveled through Harlem. anyone with a known history of stirring racial tension. And when Bumpy put out word like that, people responded quickly. His influence wasn't limited to a few streets. He had eyes and ears across the East Coast. Within days, he received confirmation that a small group connected to white supremacist circles had been spotted near Harlem around the time of the murder. Was the moment everything snapped into focus for Bumpy. He realized the attack wasn't meant to kill a random young man. It was meant to provoke him, to spark chaos, to make him lash out so that authorities could come crashing down on Harlem. It was a setup, one designed to pull him into a trap. Bumpy was furious, but he wasn't reckless. He understood strategy better than anyone in the underworld. He didn't rush. He didn't explode in retaliation. Instead, he sat back and studied the trap being laid for him. And in that moment, Harlem realized why Bumpy was feared and respected. He didn't just react. He calculated. While the police ignored the evidence, Bumpy collected enough information to build a clearer picture of what happened than the detectives themselves. And Harlem watched him do it quietly, efficiently, and without a badge. By the seventh day, he knew the who, the why, and the how. All that remained was the when, and only Bumpy controlled that part of the story. The community held its breath, knowing the next move wouldn't come from the police or politicians or any official force. It would come from Bumpy Johnson himself, and when he finally acted, the city would feel it.